Psychology in Seattle.
Hey, deserving listeners, it's just me today. It's spring cleaning. This is chapter 3 of me answering the patron emails. I have a long list here. This is not going to be a patron-only episode. I feel like I've had way too many of those recently, so let's get into it. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. This first email is about anger and anger management. It's from patron Ashley. She writes, "Have you ever done an episode on anger issues? I feel like difficulties with anger are an issue that is not given enough compassion in the psychological community. It'd be great to have an episode that includes tips for those who struggle with disproportionate anger, how to de-escalate oneself, and so forth. It would also be good to have tips for those who are around someone with anger issues, like a parent or friend or partner, etc." End of email. Good. So the first thing I'll say is that anger is a very complicated topic. Yeah, Ashley, you're mainly talking about what I might call like unjustified anger or unhealthy anger or something. But just to broaden it out a little bit, anger is an extremely complicated thing. We often equate it with aggression or rage or annoying people who get angry or something. But anger is a wonderful emotion, like any of the emotions, like fear, sadness, or joy, or love. It's all what we do with it, right? Do we allow ourselves to be angry when in a healthy way? You know, what does healthy anger exactly look like? Are we supposed to let go of our anger? I would say not usually. And if anything, most of my clients, I spend a lot of time trying to get them to express their anger rather than suppressing it. The vast majority of people in our society, even those people with quote-unquote anger problems, have been shamed so much for all emotions, particularly anger, and they have a very weird relationship with anger, so they don't express it. I love anger. I've come to really, really love it. You know, people who listen to the podcast know when I get angry, and I appreciate it. Now, there are times when it's not healthy, even on the podcast. Sometimes I will discount Umberto or something. That's probably the most obvious example that I can think of. And yeah, I'm hot under the collar. I'm getting into it. I feel hurt, or I feel unheard, or I feel discounted, and I'm lashing out and I'm trying to overpower or something. And yeah, so those moments, it's not great. But the rest of the time, I would say, just a rough estimate, 95% of the time I'm expressing anger on this podcast, I feel like it's a healthy expression. I'm getting upset, you know, I'm getting angry about the way people treat other people. I'm getting angry at the way people treat me. I'm getting angry at our stupid society and how we have many backward ideas about gay people and trans people and poor people and rich people and black people and Asians and white people and Jewish people. And, you know, I get real angry about that. And I really love being angry about that because it fucking deserves anger. If we don't get angry about certain things, then we're lost. Anger motivates us. Anger gets us up in the morning. Anger points us in a direction. Anger gets us talking and gets others to galvanize with us, and we can make things happen. Everything good that has happened in our society has been sparked by anger. Angry black people at segregation in the South caused the civil rights movement. Angry early colonists started the American Revolution to break away from the British Empire because they were angry about taxes and about lack of representation. Anger about being treated like shit as gay people led to movements in New York City and San Francisco and other places that led to eventually today where it's legal for gay people to get married. Anger is what moves us. Anger is wonderful, and we all have to value anger. I find that a lot of therapists and a lot of people in society, whenever we're talking about anger, we're talking about how to suppress it, how to let it go. You know, the way you asked this question, Ashley, is, you know, those people who struggle with disproportionate anger. Well, maybe they're not actually struggling with anger. Maybe actually the anger is what's good. Maybe the problem is they're suppressing it in a way that makes it pop out in this weird way. So, you're not exactly saying that, Ashley. I mean, I really enjoy your question. But anyway, I hope you get my point here. Okay, so the other thing we want to talk about is there are different types of anger. And I did teach anger management back in the day to both people. So back in the day when I worked at agencies, there would be a pretty steady flow of people who would get referred sometimes by their own accord or sometimes by court order because of some problem that was deemed as being a cause of anger. And we would assess them and we would figure out what sort of problem they had. And they would go into one of three camps. They either went into individual or family therapy, couples therapy, psychotherapy, that route. Or they went to what we called anger management, which was anger management classes. It was for 10 weeks for an hour and a half class, I think, once a week. So it was a 10-week class, and you just learned different ways of coping with your anger and managing it. And then there was the third option, which was the domestic violence treatment, which was a year-long intensive outpatient treatment, group therapy, essentially. And people in this category would often have been charged with an assault, fourth degree or higher, someone who had hit their spouse or done something physically abusive to their spouse, been prosecuted, gone to court, and the court orders them into domestic violence treatment. And so there's a lot of different kinds of people that we would find. And when I would work with these people, either in the DV group, the anger management, or psychotherapy group, I always wanted to talk with them about, well, let's broaden this out. One, let's not shame anger. We're not here to shame anger. We're here to actually perhaps wrap our arms of love around our anger so that we can actually have a good relationship with our anger. The other thing I want to talk about is there's different kinds of anger, just like there's different kinds of happiness or sadness or something. So we don't want to pigeonhole all of anger into one little thing, because anger in some ways might be the most varied emotion of all the emotions. There's just so many different situations and types and expressions and experiences of it. So the first kind that I can think of off the top of my head is a justified type of anger. Your coworker steals something from, your coworker steals your stapler and you're angry about that. Well, that's justified. When your government doesn't support measures to reduce greenhouse gases, that should make you angry. If you're not angry about that, there's something wrong with you, right? So this is justified anger. You should be angry about that. This anger, we evolved in all likelihood to motivate us to do something. If we didn't have this anger response, we wouldn't be motivated. Think about the feeling of anger. You get hot under the collar. Your blood starts to boil, people will say. Their heart starts to pound. Their adrenaline starts to go. Well, this is a fight or flight response, and often it's a fight response, right? It's like you have to fight for your resources. You have to strike back. If we were on the Serengeti, 300,000 years ago, and some rival tribe came over and started taking all your stuff, then you got to get angry. If a rival tribe came over to try to steal your child, your infant, you should get angry about that, right? Anger is wonderful in that way. So we have to embrace the wonderful aspects of anger in that way. So that's justifying anger. And those situations, again, if you're not angry, what's wrong with you? You should be angry. Again, it's what we do with the anger. It's not the emotion. The emotion is not the problem. It's what we do. In fact, anger, back in the day, we started using this phrase of anger responses. It's not anger. Anger is not the problem. The problem is our response to our own anger. That's the thing we have to think about. If you're at work and your coworker takes your stapler and you walk up and you punch them in the face, because that's you embracing your anger, then we have to ask ourselves, is that the right thing to be doing? Is that what you really want to be doing given your overall goals? What's your goal here? Your anger tells you something's wrong, and your anger is motivating you to do something. Think about the end goal. What sort of outcome do you want to have? Well, what you want to have is you want to get your stapler back, and you want to make sure that person doesn't steal your stapler or anything else again. And you want to kind of tell everyone else, look, don't steal my shit. So So that's your goal. Well, how are you going to manage that? That's what your anger is motivating you to do. And until you right that wrong, you're going to be upset. You're going to be angry. But if you just walk over and punch them in the face, it's going too far, and now you have all these consequences to it. You might go to jail. You might lose your job. That's not what your goal was. Your goal was just to get the stapler back and to make sure they didn't do it again, or maybe even understand why they took it in the first place. Who knows? So anyway, so there's justified anger. The other type, or it's not really a different type, but another way of looking at anger is through the attachment lens. John Bowlby, I did a 17-hour deep dive on John Bowlby and attachment not too long ago. And one of the things that I talked about in the deep dive was about anger. And that anger, we all, like I said, we evolved it, and it motivates us to do a lot of things. And one of the things that it motivates to do is to manage our attachments, to stay close to people. So when we were infants, we would be separated occasionally from our parents or caregivers, and that would freak us out. And we evolved a lot of emotions to, kick in when we can't see our parents. And these emotions motivate certain things. And so when you're 18 months old, you might cry, right? You might get sad. And at first, your parents leave the room and you start to cry. Then when they come back, you might actually, if it took them too long to get back, you might actually be angry at them. You might be like, how come you left me? And you might actually, infants will sometimes even strike their parents in a very weak fashion. And so Bowlby believed that anger in this way evolved among the human species as a behavior to protest separation or neglect, that all children will express anger in this way. And regardless of what they learned, it's just something that we are born with. In the same way that children are born with the response of crying when they're separated from their parents. You don't learn that. It's just something you're born with. And so we look at anger through that lens of like, okay, well, what kind of analogy or grown-up version of that happens to us where we feel angry? So when someone takes our stapler, we could look at that as an act of separation, an act of being rejected by the tribe or something. Or maybe a better example that I will often use is your spouse you're at dinner with your spouse, and your spouse keeps looking at their phone and they're not paying attention to you. Well, this is analogous to your parents leaving you alone at preschool the first day at preschool. You feel neglected, you feel hurt, you feel rejected, you feel alone, and this makes you feel sad and angry. So you feel hurt, and then you have this anger response to motivate you to say, hey, put your phone down, because you're actually expressing love for this person, or it comes from a place of attachment and love. And that is a very useful way of looking at a lot of anger, particularly when we're thinking about interpersonal. When I'm angry at the government for not supporting laws that reduce greenhouse gases, it's not necessarily attachment. That's like more sort of a territory or some sort of a safety reaction. But attachment in my world, the vast majority of anger problems come from this attachment issue. Someone actually asked on Discord recently, in the Discord chat, about whether, how do we deal with people who are impatient? I think they were like, maybe their partner was impatient or something, and they were like, how do I deal with my partner when they're so impatient all the time? And I was trying to get into it over text, but it was hard because, this Discord is a lot of typing. I actually might change it to be more verbs, microphone based, whatever you call that, because then I can just talk. But when people are impatient, often it's because they feel a sense of they're hurt, or they feel a sense of danger, and then they'll get impatient. And impatience is kind of often a manifestation of anger, right? It's an expression of hostility, like, why are you taking so long? And so anyway, so attachment is what I was talking about. All right, so we have justified anger, and another way of looking at it is through attachment lens. And mood is also another thing to look at. is that for a lot of people, they suffer from ongoing mood changes or just a depressed mood or an irritable mood. And, through bipolar or depression or just general irritability, then that's another way of thinking about anger. When you're at your wit's end, when you're tired, when you've been treated like shit recently, you just don't have a lot of capacity to have grace for other people. And you might actually just be irritable and angry. So that's another way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is through the personality disorder lens. And this is also related to attachment, of course. Personality disorders like conduct disorder, psychopathy, antisocial, narcissistic, borderline, histrionic. These people were relationally traumatized early in life and are very sensitive to being relationally hurt in their adult life and will act out through various different attachment behaviors. They might have exaggerated attachment behaviors such as anger. So that's just another way of looking at it. Another way of looking at anger is through the trauma lens. Often when people are abused as children, they, one, have a skewed sense of what's okay to rage about, and two, they're very sensitive to threat. So I've seen this before with a lot of people, is that so say you grew up with a father who was would rage a lot, was angry a lot, and would yell at everyone a lot and intimidate people a lot. Well, you're being traumatized as a child during those moments, and you learn what you see. So what you're looking at is you're seeing, my God, like, I guess rage is normal, or I guess it's okay for men to rage. And as you grow up, you start realizing that that's not the case. You start going, no, my dad was weird. He wasn't normal. Other people don't do that. But your gauge for that never really quite fades away. And so part of you still considers it normal. And so when you're angry, you have a skewed sense of what is okay, because you were given this model, an example that was so extreme, and you're better, that you're not as bad as your dad is as an adult because you've gone through therapy and you've learned, but you still have a skewed sense of what is moral and what's okay. A lot of similar things happen with cheating on people. When you're abandoned or when you're relationally hurt growing up, or even if your parents cheated on each other, then you grow up with this different sense of like what is okay to do in that situation. You have a different gauge of like where the line is. And so even though you're trying to not be like your parents, sometimes it's hard to be like your parent, hard not to be like your parents. The other thing is that when you're traumatized in this way, you're being yelled at, you're being intimidated, you're scared, you're kind of like a raw nerve as you grow up. And when anything happens to you, then this side of you sort of kicks in to protect yourself. And because there's a part of you that believes something very terrible has happened. As an example, I would watch this recent YouTube video of this guy. He was a military guy, and he was just raging about a minor fender bender that happened. So essentially what happened, I think it was a pretty viral video, so people may have seen it, but if you Google it, you'll find it. Essentially what happened was this guy was with his wife in the car. His wife was actually in the military, and the guy just barely bumped the car in front of him. And the car in front of him, the guy gets out and starts banging on the window and saying like, come outside, I'm going to fight you. And then the girlfriend or the wife who's in the military, she starts to film this whole thing. The driver is just sitting there staring at his steering wheel, like going, okay, I'll just wait for the cops to show up, because I'm not gonna walk outside and fight this guy, and I'm also not gonna acknowledge him, because why? He's going crazy. But the guy outside, you can just see him with this phone video. The guy is banging on the window. He's like, "Get out here, or I'm gonna kick your ass. How come you're not coming out here? I'm gonna get out here. You pussy. I'm gonna kick you." And it just goes on and on and on and on. And the point of this viral video is like, look at this douchebag in the military who, can't handle having his car barely bumped. And then some other military guys finally arrive and they start to grab the guy, hold him back, and then he really flips out. And in that moment, it was when I realized that this guy in all likelihood suffers from PTSD. It doesn't justify the anger response, but it explains it. I actually had this happen to me when I was young. I was driving as a 16-year-old with my friends around Factoria in Bellevue next to Seattle. And it was a summer afternoon and we were being obnoxious and I thought I saw some friends of mine. So I started backing my car up and I didn't see that there was a car behind me. And at the very last minute, my friend was like, "Hey, Honda, car." And so I slammed on the brakes, but I bumped the car behind me. And the guy, I looked in my rear view mirror and it was like a nice, like, white 280Z, if you remember that car. It was like one of the sweet 80s cars. And I see this douchebag looking kind of guy get out of his car and he takes his sunglasses off. He throws them on the ground and he stomps on his own sunglasses. And I thought, oh boy. So I see him walking up to the car and I'm like, okay, I don't want to have anything to do with this guy. So I start rolling up my window. Back then, you have manual rolling up. And so I'm rolling up the window because I'm just thinking, I need to give him some time to cool off. I'm not going to fight this guy. That's stupid. So I'm rolling up the window and I'm just about to lock the door. And he grabs, I didn't expect him to do this. He opened my car door and he grabbed my door and bent it beyond its range and bent my entire like door thing, hinge and the fender behind the door. He just imagine just this massively raging douchebag just like ranking on my car door. And I'm looking over and I'm just like, whoa. I mean, again, remember, I'm in a parking lot and I backed up and barely touched his bumper. And by the way, no damage, just like a gunk, like the way you might kind of bump a car when you're parking or something. And I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, what is going on here? And then he grabs in, I'm in a totally defenseless position because I'm sitting down with a seatbelt on and I can't, you can't really defend yourself. And I'm right-handed. So he's at my left side and I can't, and he starts to pummel me. He's like reaching into the car and he's beating on me. And my friends are trying to save me. So they're pulling me because I have a friend in the passenger seat. I also have a friend in the back seat. And both of them are trying to pull me away from this guy. So one guy is, he's got his hand on me and he's just hitting me on my side of my head as hard as he can. And my other friends are pulling me like, hey, stop. I just felt like this sack of potatoes just being passed, between these two people. And then, so the friend that I saw that I backed up for, I was driving through the parking lot, like, oh my God, my friend was this small fire plug? That's not the right term, but some firecracker, spark plug. That's what I'm trying to think. She was a spark plug. She was short and fiery. And she comes running up on the guy, small little girl. She comes running up on the guy and she's like, what the fuck are you doing? And she just starts screaming at him. And now I'm getting my senses back. I'm like back in my seat and I'm looking over and I see this little blonde girl just screaming at him and chastising him. And the guy just turned on a dime in his emotions and was now totally ashamed of what he did. I could see it. I could see that he was just beside himself. He was like, oh my God, what did I just do? And he's just sort of surveying the situation, like his sunglasses, no damage, the door, me, this random girl yelling at him in a parking lot. And I can't remember what we did. I think we sued the guy, if I'm not, my parents like helped me sue him because he had to pay for the damage to the car. But anyway, I didn't really know it at the time, but when I think back, I I'm quite positive the guy had PTSD. Imagine you're in your sweet car. So the narrative is like douchebag, right? The narrative is like, oh my God, he's a douchebag. And certainly that was my narrative at the time, and just furthered my divorce with aggression as a young male. Even though I was captain of the football team, and when I was on the football field, man, did I love to thump people. But off of the football field, I was a pacifist. I thought that aggression and violence in those areas were completely illogical, immature, and is often the bane of our society, killing millions upon millions of people for no reason. And so that was another example of just like me learning, like, oh yeah, that's right. That's a world I do not want to go to. That's a world I'm going to reject, and I'm going to be a pacifist. And there are many other times when that would happen, like where I'd be in some kind of a fight, and I'd be the one just standing there going like, I'm not going to participate in this. I realize you're calling me a pussy, and I don't care. If you attack me, I'll defend myself. But you random guy on the street insulting my manhood, I don't care about your opinion about my manhood, and two, what is manhood? I think it's more manly to look at you and go like, okay, enough of that silliness. Anyway, so later I realized I was looking at situations like that, and I realized that in all likelihood I had PTSD. So imagine you're sitting in your car, and you see this car in front of you stop, and you stop your car in a parking lot, and then all of a sudden the car throws it, it's in reverse, and it comes, speeding back towards you, and then bumps your bumper. Well, if you have been traumatized either through war or through family life or through being bullied, then your body has changed. You have a physiological reaction to that sort of thing. It's the same thing after being raped or any sort of trauma, and your body goes into another state. So we've all experienced this where we lose our temper, right? All of us have been like, oh boy, I lost my temper in that moment. I was too angry. I lost perspective. Well, there's a reason why we have that mechanism, which is like, there are times when you need to lose perspective. There are times when you need to freak out to defend yourself or to defend the people that you love. You don't have time to just think, well, okay, I'm kind of angry. What do I want to do? We evolved this mechanism of extreme anger responses when we are in extreme danger. So if you have been as a child going, or before through some sort of ongoing trauma, been made to feel as if you are in extreme constant danger, then there's a certain pathway in your neurons that becomes very habituated in that it doesn't take much to pull that trigger in your neurons. And so with that guy, he's sitting in the car in front of him stops and then reverses and, bangs into his car. His nervous system in all likelihood kicked into something that was old and very familiar to him. And what he learned growing up was you either have to run or you got to fight. And you don't have time to think. You just got to act. And so he just jumped out of the car, and so he was just gonna pound me because that's what his instinct told him to do. And then as soon as this woman comes up and starts to chastise him, that probably was some sort of transference about his mom, and he snapped out of it. And that's real. Now, I don't have that kind of PTSD, so that doesn't happen to me. But there's countless reports of people, particularly war veterans, who have these kinds of responses. The Robert Bales case, the guy in Afghanistan who went on the killing spree and killed dozens of people, civilians in Afghanistan. The defense, anyway, was that defense. And I'm partial to that argument. I don't think he should necessarily go free. I don't know what the legal system should do, but and he killed innocent Afghanistan people, so there's that. But it's a real thing that when you go through war like that amount of pressure and that amount of danger on a daily basis, your brain develops a very itchy trigger finger, a very sensitive trigger finger to that kind of response that we only need to depend on every now and then. But when you're in constant need of that response, then that response is very quick. And so there's this video online of that kind of thing. So that's how trauma can result in anger. Now, I hesitate to give that example. Well, what I should say is to people is, whenever you see people getting angry, don't necessarily interpret it as trauma related, because it might not be, but it is possible. I'm not justifying it. I'm not justifying the guy who pummeled me and broke my door of my car because I barely tapped his bumper. I obviously am not justifying that behavior, but it explains something. And what it points us to is that we have a lot of people walking around with completely undiagnosed and untreated PTSD, and they're walking time bombs. And we see examples of these people flipping out in society often. And when you grow up in a very unsafe community, neighborhood, and your families typically grew up in those kind of neighborhoods and had to fight a lot for their own safety, then you're gonna see kids with some pretty aggressive, odd responses to things. And you'll see videos like this. You'll see a bunch of poor kids just going crazy on police officers. And the thing that they don't show is, well, where did all that aggression come from? And how much danger and unsafety has that child been subjected to that makes them very quick to become aggressive? I have this, in the past, I don't know, 6 months or something, YouTube suggests videos to you, right? It'll be like, maybe you might like this. And for whatever reason, it started suggesting all these like police cam videos that I started watching. And as I'm watching it, I'm seeing all these, not all the time, but sometimes the suspect or the perp or whatever, it reacts very aggressively. Like someone will get pulled over for speeding, and the police officer will say a couple of questions, and the driver will be kind of snotty, and the police officer say, well, I'm going to ask you to step out of the car. And then the person's like, I'm not going to do it. And then the police officer grabs the person, and then it escalates. The person in the car doesn't submit, and they just freak out. And the comments in YouTube, which are always awful, but the comments are often like, oh, that piece of shit, or, why did that person not just comply with the police officer? If you don't comply, you get what you get. But often, and maybe that's true, but one of the things that I often will see is, I suspect that person had been physically violated often in their life and have a very itchy trigger finger, sensitive trigger finger on defend yourself physically when someone puts hands on you. And it's not rational. It's not something that the person is like, okay, I don't like this cop, I'm not going to let them cuff me. It's something that kicks in for them that's primal, that maybe they were, you got a 22-year-old black male who might have been like severely sexually abused from the age of like 3 until he was 7. And then this police officer walks up and puts hands on him. It's not going to go over well. So it's something that I think we ignore. I'm not saying police shouldn't be able to do what they have to do, but I'm saying that as a society, we have to help to raise awareness for this and actually treat it in people. The last angle of looking at anger I thought of is through drug inducement. There are certain substances that can elicit anger. Cocaine, for example, can increase aggression. PCP. There are certain drugs that they don't always increase aggression by any means, but they can. So it's just another way of looking at anger. All right. There are probably other ways of looking at it, but those are the things I could think of off the top of my head. So that's like different lenses. But now let's look at like manifestations, like experience of anger. Well, one is an internal feeling that So when we talk about anger, again, we're often talking about bad behaviors, anger management. You have a problem with anger. Why are you so angry? We usually are using the word anger when we're talking about bad things, but we also have to acknowledge, again, it's just a feeling like sadness. And you can have anger inside of you and not have it be a problem and have no behaviors. Maybe you say, I feel angry, but you don't have anything beyond that. Another thing that can be a manifestation of anger is agitation or arousal, so that fight or flight response. Another is aggression or hostility. This is when you're actually attacking other people verbally, mentally, or physically. Another is turning inward. A lot of people turn their anger inward, and it can become self-hate and depression. And also an anger manifestation is motivation to take action. That's another manifestation of anger. All right, so let's look at treatment. Well, it depends on the reason, but when we're talking about anger management in general, often what we're talking about is some kind of cognitive therapy or behavioral therapy, DBT, ACT, this kind of thing. And you're working on people's cognitions, you're working on people's behaviors, they're often angry when they're driving a car, and so someone doesn't use their turn signal right, and you just completely flip out and you like road rage and this sort of thing. So the cognition there is like, okay, they didn't use their blinker. Why? Well, if your narrative is that they didn't use their blinker because they're a piece of shit and they need to be told that they're a piece of shit, then that'll make you feel a certain way and might motivate certain behaviors. But if you think they didn't use their blinker because maybe they have a cognitive problem, maybe they're older and they're having a little harder time getting around, maybe they're distracted, maybe they just didn't see you, or maybe they I don't know, there's just a lot of different reasons why all of us have not used our blinkers at times when we should have. It's just a mistake that people make sometimes. Now, having said that, people, please use your blinkers. But if you tell yourself a different story, then you're going to have a different emotion. You're going to have a different response. And so that's where cognitive therapy comes in. Another treatment for anger is through attachment, psychodynamic, interpersonal work, where you're trying to get corrective emotional experiences for the trauma or the neglect or the relational traumas that you've been through, so that you're less threatened by certain behaviors that will make you less hurt and less angry in response. When you're alone and when you have nobody and you've never had anybody, then you're very quick to anger. This is the MGTOW people and the incel people. They're very lonely, and in all likelihood, they've never had anybody close to them. And so they're very angry, and they should be angry. They're pointing it in weird directions, but they should be angry. To expect a incel who has never had a close relationship to not be angry it's not fair. They should be angry. But it's just, we have to help them understand their anger and help them to have secure relationships, and so that they just have a less baseline anger. Couple and family therapy is another route for treating anger. People are often angry in interpersonal situations, and helping you have an angry wife and you bring in the couple and you find that she's angry because she's hurt a lot. She doesn't really know she's hurt a lot. And through the therapy and couples therapy, you'll learn that there are interactions between the husband and wife that cause both people to feel hurt. And one of the manifestations of that hurt is the wife being angry. So when you actually work on that relationship, you can reduce the reason why anyone in that relationship was being angry. Of course, you can do domestic violence or intimate partner violence treatment, or you can just take a class on anger management. There's a lot of different ways. But so getting back to your question, patron Ashley, you're asking, it'd be great to have an episode that includes tips for those who struggle with disproportionate anger, how to de-escalate oneself, and so forth. Again, the tips completely depend on the foundation of the anger itself. So emotional awareness, emotional regulation is a wonderful thing. It's very hard to do, though. We often sort of think like, well, okay, just look at your anger, take a deep breath. I mean, deep breaths, great. If that works for you, that can work for everybody to a certain extent. But if you're angry because you have PTSD, or if you're angry because you've never had a secure relationship in your life, or if you're angry because you're being treated like shit by people, then, deep breaths are fine, but there's another full world of quote unquote anger management that has to be addressed, if you know what I'm saying. You also ask, it would be good to have some tips for those who are around someone with anger issues, like parents, friends, partners, etc. Same advice is the person. So if you have an angry person in your life, you have to figure out why they're angry. Often what people will do, like I said, is they'll say, stop being angry. They'll look at their angry child or their angry parent or friend, and they'll just be like, you have to stop being angry. Stop it. You need to stop that. And on some level, that's okay. If someone's being aggressive or out of control or something, there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, let's bring it down a couple notches. But the bigger issue is you have to ask this person, like, what are you trying to do with this anger? Why are you angry? And I'm genuinely curious, because this podcast told me that, you're angry for a reason. So please tell me why you're angry. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily know. For example, if you have an angry spouse that's often angry at you, in all likelihood, it's because they feel hurt by you, and the hurt in all likelihood is because they feel rejected by you somehow. They feel alone. They feel like you don't care. They feel criticized. They feel like you're not loyal. You're not dedicated to them. And when you actually figure that out, then you have your answer to the anger. It doesn't mean that they can get angry all the time. It doesn't mean that they're justified in that way. But it means, like, okay, once you figure that all out, then you have an interpersonal way of actually managing the relationship, so the person doesn't ever have to be angry to begin with. So they never have to manage anything. That's really the key to anger management, is like, how do we get to a place where you don't need to manage your anger, because the anger that you have is appropriate and healthy to begin with, and there's nothing you have to sort of wrestle with. If you're wrestling with your anger, then in all likelihood it's because something deeper is at play, and that's the thing you have to attack. You might benefit from some anger management tips in the short term. That's why cognitive therapy and behavioral therapy, cognitive therapy particularly, is so great in the short term. That's what I do with a lot of people, is I'll do a combination of cognitive schema narrative therapy that addresses the short-term issues, but I'm also doing attachment-based psychodynamic interpersonal work for the long-term healing, so that we can eliminate the reasons why they have the problem to begin with. But in the meantime, they need some way of coping, which often you can do through cognitive therapy. So that is my answer to that. Let's go on to another email. Actually, I talked for a lot longer than I thought I would, so let's take a break. All right, we're back from the break. I have some announcements to make. First off, I don't know if I've said this in the podcast yet, but someone figured out the code in the new intro music. It is just the chords of C, G, E, A, E. You had a lot of great guesses and some interesting guesses. Some people thought it was Morse code and all these other things. But basically, if you take the title, and this is what someone guessed, and as a prize, I said, well, what do you want for a prize? And what they said was they wanted a drawing from Umberto. So they're going to get one of Umberto's excellent masterpiece drawings. And these drawings, when I did the drawing thing for Umberto, I thought he would just draw something in like a couple minutes, but he spends days on these drawings. I think he did He-Man one time. Anyway, so when you take the podcast title, Psychology in Seattle, there are only 5 letters in the title that qualify as valid chords. So psychol, so you got C, psychology, and then you have the G. And then in Seattle, you have, S-E-A, E and A are both chords, and then Seattle, E at the end. So you have C-G-E-A-E. And they don't actually, and in the jingle, it's all major chords. It's major C, it's major G, major A, major E, or sorry, E, A, yeah, E, A, A, E, A, E. They're all major chords and they don't fit into the same key. There's a bit of modulation in the middle. But I thought, when I explain this to people, they're like, oh, that's pretty simple, and they're like, I thought it was some like really deep, weird code that was like buried deep in the thing. That would be something Umberto would do. Umberto would do a code that was so deep and weird and convoluted that no one would ever figure it out. I like to create things that are easy to figure out. I don't like to frustrate people. Like with the Tuesday Tougher Bluff game that I make on Facebook every Tuesday, I actually try to make the question a little intuitive, or with a little thought, you could sort of figure it out. Now, sometimes I'm really honestly trying to trick people, but also it's just a tougher bluff. So it's just true or false. And so, I like quizzes that people can answer. Like whenever I see people devising quizzes for an event or a podcast, and the people trying to guess are like, geez, I don't know. That's when you've designed a question that is terrible. The question has to be right on the edge of a little bit hard, but not hard enough. And there's a very fine zone there. And anyway, so when I was devising a code to put into the jingle, I just was thinking about it. I was like, oh, okay, that's pretty simple. And I thought, well, someone will guess that pretty soon. But apparently it was so easy that all of you musicians out there thought that couldn't be it because it's too easy. And then you went down these other roads. And so this, I can't remember her name, the patron, but she commented on Facebook. She's like, well, at first I thought it was this, but it couldn't be that. So then I started thinking all these other things. And then I just said, nope, you got it. And she's like, really? So anyway, there you go. And I am so glad someone figured it out. Also, become a patron on patreon.com. Also, email us if you have trouble with the premium feed. And also know that I am constantly working on solutions for better technology for the premium feed and the podcast in general. And there might actually be something on the horizon, either our own app or some app that's going to partner with Patreon and make it so that all you have to do is sign up on Patreon and then maybe download one app onto your phone, and then everything will just be seamless onto your phone. So I'm sure that'll happen within the next few years, but it could happen soon. But also buy my book. It's called Multi-Role Clinical Supervision. I think last month was the first month no one bought my book, which I have to say makes me a little sad. But I spent a lot of time in that book, and I like it. If you're a supervisor, by all means, or if you're planning on becoming a supervisor. Also, if you're a clinician and you're entering supervision yourself, it might be good to kind of read it too, because I think reading it helps you understand the importance of supervision as you're going through it yourself, and might help you with advocating for yourself a little bit to make sure you get the supervision that you deserve. Because sometimes you just have to ask for a lot of supervisors, what they do is, particularly agency supervisors, what they'll do is they're just doing the administrative stuff, the signing of the notes and the scheduling and the making sure you're not fucking up in any major way. And what they neglect is the mentorship and the attachment and the true guidance, the true teaching of like how to be a therapist, how to be a wise clinician. This is what supervision is made for. That's its primary purpose. And in the book, I write a lot about that. And so sometimes as a supervisee, you have to advocate for yourself. You have to say, supervisor, I would like us to talk less about paperwork and more about my development as a wise healer of souls. So reading the book might help with that. Also, please like our Facebook page if you haven't done that. So we post pictures and that kind of thing. Also, our Instagram, we post to Instagram quite a bit. So, and we post questions and different kinds of things on Facebook and Instagram. Also, join the Facebook fan group. You can tweet Berto and we're on Twitter as well. I don't use Twitter a lot, but you can tweet us there. Berto uses Twitter at Psych0Berto. He's also on YouTube. Berto's on YouTube. Also, if you've heard us talk about Discord, every Thursday at 2:00 Seattle time, I'm going on Discord, and it's like a chat forum in real time, and we have a great time there. There's you can go there at any time, by the way. People interact all week long, and then I'm just there on Thursdays at 2. And what I'm thinking about doing is actually doing a voice chat so that people can type questions, and then I'll respond via voice, because I think it's just sometimes you ask me like these really awesome questions on Discord, and I'm trying to type really fast, and it'd just be so much easier if I could just say it. Plus, the vocalization nuances of whatnot would be perhaps helpful. But anyway, so that I want to make that kind of a thing, because a lot of people will be like, oh, I have questions for you, but blah, blah, blah. And it's like, if you just know that every Thursday at 2:00 Seattle time, you can save your questions for then, or you can just ask a little question or whatever, or you can see what other questions people have and sort of benefit from that, watching other people ask questions. Then I want to interact more with the listeners. I love getting your emails. I love responding, but there's just something more intimate about Discord, where it's just in the now, and I get that instant kind of back and forth with people. Anyway. Also, if you're looking for older episodes, go to the website. It's the best way to get older episodes. I get emails pretty much every day. People are like, I can't find this one episode on the app. And I'm like, or they, a lot of people don't even know that there's other ways to listen to the podcast other than Patreon. Like, I had no idea that people thought Patreon was the only way to listen to the podcast. If you're having troubles with Patreon, know that Patreon is not set up for podcasting. It's not a podcasting platform. It's a subscription platform. The best way is through various other ways. And if you're having trouble, email me at contact@psychologyinseattle.com. There are 3 ways to mainly listen to the podcast. There's Patreon, which is fine for mainly like recent episodes, and there's your phone app, which both has the free feed, which has the ads on it, and then the premium feed, which is for patrons. And then there's the website, which both has the free episodes and the Patreon episodes as well. I personally think that website is a great resource if you're looking for different things. Like, for example, I have one page with all Dungeons and Dragons episodes. I have another page with all Game of Thrones episodes. I have one page with all family therapy episodes. Another page, let me just read all the pages just to kind of give people what's what on what's happening. And while I'm clicking, I just keep talking. And here we are on psychologyinseattle.com. Okay, so I have movies and TVs. I have a page for that. I have public figures. I have sexuality page. I have a theories page, a psychodynamic page, a therapy, different kinds of therapy page, a psychopathology page, a personality disorder page, a social justice page, a gender page, a page on politics, a page that has all the episodes on evolutionary psychology, another page for professional therapy things, another page for ethical things, another page that's just dedicated to novice clinicians, all the episodes where I'm trying to give advice for novice clinicians. I have another page just for the couples episodes. I have another page for for clients, like advocating for clients. I have another page for parenting. I have another page I have episodes in which I've talked about how to do podcasting. And then I have, other pages as well. But anyway, so I use the website. I think it's a great resource. While I'm just doing all the different things here, we're always trying to get to the next goal on Patreon, and we're pretty close to the goal, the next goal, which is to give away our 3rd scholarship for $2,000, and we're also going to give $1,000 to petfinder.com, which saves animals from being euthanized and sets them up with loving families. So it's really amazing, as people sign up on Patreon and we meet certain goals. We've given thousands of dollars to charities. I don't know, 10,000+ or something. And it's humbling because Psychology in Seattle, it's basically just me. Umberto shows up at my house and, I set up the microphone for him and he talks for a few hours and then he goes home. He doesn't really do anything beyond that. My wife helps out here and there. By the way, if you're getting any sort of swag in the mail, my wife is the one that's taking care of all that kind of stuff. And so it's basically just me. And so when I get a big thrill writing out a check to different charities or for the scholarships. And, by the end of 2019, I'm guessing we will have given out at least 3 scholarships this year. One was for $2,000. Another one will be for $2,500, and another one will be for $2,000. That's a big deal for a scholarship. I mean, my university is a small university, so it doesn't have a lot of extra funds for this sort of thing. And our scholarships are on the level of like $400 or something. And it was actually kind of funny. I don't know what to say, but I was at a faculty meeting at my university, and people are giving out announcements, and they're like, yeah, so we're, make sure you tell everyone we're going to give out a $500 scholarship. And everyone's like, oh, great. And then I'm like, oh, yeah. And I raised my hand. I'm like, well, and my podcast is giving out a $2,500 scholarship as well. And everyone just kind of looks at me like, what? And like, my dumb little podcast is giving bigger scholarships than my university is in a way. I mean, I don't know if that's empirically true for all the scholarships that my university gives out, but to me, the only reason why I'm saying this, not to brag, but to say that you as it's your money. It's not my money. You are the ones that are the patrons who are signing up on Patreon, and you are donating that money to those people. So congratulations to you, how you have made a difference in people's lives. You've saved pets from being euthanized. You've given homes to the homeless. You've helped LGBTQ youth. You people have done that. So be proud of yourself in that way. And I don't want to stop. I want to, for the rest of my life, I want to funnel part of the Patreon money towards those goals, towards those charities, those causes. I just think it's a wonderful thing that you all are doing. This is a pivot. I'm looking at my list. If you are an employer and you want to hire people and you want to sign up on ZipRecruiter.com, you might hear other podcasts advertising this, and you're thinking about signing up on ZipRecruiter, when you sign up on ZipRecruiter.com/psychology in Seattle, so if you use that URL and you sign up, ZipRecruiter.com/psychology in Seattle, then we get a kickback. We have yet to get a kickback, so I have a feeling that my listeners are not in the market to signing up for ZipRecruiter.com, and hence I barely ever talk about it, but it's on my list here, so I thought I'd rattle it off. What else? I'm just getting all the different announcements out of the way here. The scholarship for $2,500, our second scholarship, is underway. The application deadline has not happened yet. That's at June 30th at the end of the month. So if you or you know someone else who is a graduate, we're preferring graduate students in mental health. So someone in, training to be a clinician, training to be a mental health clinician, and they are in graduate school, doctoral or a master's program, and they have a year left and they have a need. So we're not just looking for people who are in graduate school. We're actually looking for people who, one, there's something about them where they're like, look, I'm pretty low on money. I can't really depend on other people in this way. The other thing we're looking for are people that have made a difference in the world and or are going to make a difference in the world. So because obviously as a clinician, you're going to make a difference in the world, but I'm also just looking for that extra thing. Like the last person we gave the scholarship to, the $2,000 scholarship to, she had already made such a difference in the community. She had, I believe she's in Seattle, right? Yeah. I didn't want to privilege people in Seattle, but she's African American young woman and doesn't listen to the podcast, by the way. She just, someone that did listen to the podcast told her about it. And she's a doctoral student in a PsyD program, and she works in a very underprivileged community in Seattle, South Seattle. I think White Center is where she's working. We have this neighborhood called White Center. It's actually next to South Park. We have a South Park in Seattle, and White Center is near South Park, and they're both underprivileged communities. And she has chosen to work in those communities, and she trains other clinicians on how to work with African American people and how to work with underprivileged people. So I can't remember all the things that she had done already, but she already did a lot of things anyway. And she had completely run out of money, and she was going to have to either drop out of school or put her school on hold for a while because she couldn't afford the next quarter's in tuition, which was like already due. Let's see. The other thing we're looking for this actually is another sort of whole area here that I'm looking for, are one, the fan page on Facebook that I don't go to. It's just for fans. It has a lot of really dedicated people like April and Amy and Lyndon, and there's a bunch of people who are pretty active there. But we're looking for a moderator. So if anyone wants to, it's not a full-time job by any means. It's just like someone who just kind of makes sure everything's copacetic over there and make sure, because I can moderate other places, like I moderate everything else, but I can't moderate. I don't want to moderate that because I want it to just be for fans, and I want them to be able to talk about in the Facebook fan group, knowing that I'm not going to ever go there, so you can complain about me or whatever. So if you want to moderate that, let me know. That would be cool. Also, if you think about wanting to ever volunteer your time or maybe even getting paid for your time for the podcast, and you have an idea, like you want to start psychology in Denver or something, and you want to partner with me, or you want to become an intern with us and you want to do research for me and maybe even do episodes with me or something, I'm open. I wonder if anyone has thoughts like that and they're like, Kirk doesn't want that. I'm open to having a conversation. I obviously can't guarantee that it's something that I'm interested in, but I am interested in having the conversation because I want a lot of other, I like collaborating with other people. As the podcast grows, I want more people involved, and like a dream to me would be to have paid employees who do research, who look up research, who compile notes. We work on different episodes together, and then when we make an episode, it's more well produced. I should, and maybe even some reporting. Like you actually go out into the field and ask people questions, and compile different packages in that way. I don't know if that's something anyone's interested in doing, but I could imagine that being pretty cool. So if you're into that kind of thing, I'd love to talk with you. Or if you want to be an illustrator for the podcast, you just want to, some people will submit art. If you want to do some art for the website, like you want to draw me and Umberto arguing at each other or something, I love stuff like that when people send me stuff like that. So if you have suggestions or whatever, I just am interested. So email me at contact@psychologyinseattle.com or go to the Discord and we can talk about it there. Okay, I think that's all the announcements I have. It took me a long time. All right, let's go into another email. What do you say? All right, this next email is from patron Karen. Karen was wanting to ask questions about trauma-informed care and the adverse childhood experiences study and protective factors. She says, a lot of organizations that routinely see young families, including some pediatrician offices, Head Start programs, and WIC programs, have in recent years adopted some things to help them make an impact with people who are experiencing trauma, such as trauma-informed care, emotional regulation, etc. I'm hoping in the future there will be more guidance on what we can tell moms, teach young children, or encourage people close to those suffering from routine trauma. Yeah, interesting email, patron Karen. I had to do a little bit of a shallow dive into this because it's not really my area, since as a therapist who focuses on trauma, I have always known about trauma, I suppose, in my professional career, and I'm always focusing on trauma and what trauma-informed care so let me get into this. So anyway, I had to look into it a little bit because it's just not my area, but it was interesting to learn about. What I learned was that trauma-informed care can mean a lot of different things, but in general, what it means is that it's this notion that when people go to a doctor's office or the ER, or they're even just going to their social worker to talk about food stamps, we might do better by these people if the helpers and the social workers and the teachers and the physicians understand how to provide trauma-informed care, meaning that they understand that some people might be traumatized, and therefore, unless they adjust their practice somehow, they might actually cause more trauma for the patient. For example, say a woman has been raped, for example, or she was sexually abused growing up, and she goes to a new physician, and the physician is a male, and the physician asks, and the woman has complaints about abdominal pain, or something in her groin region is bothering her, and the physician says, "Okay, well, if I could ask you to, I'll leave the room. If you could disrobe, I'll come back in the room." The normal procedure. Well, for a lot of people, they're like, "Okay, I'm at the doctor. I'm asking about my groin area. Of course, I want him to look at it, so I'm going to disrobe, and it's going to be a little uncomfortable, but I'm cool with it. I understand. I'm not triggered in any way." Whereas if you were sexually abused and the physician resembles the abuser in any sort of way, even just being male can sometimes trigger in that way, and this might be one of the only doctor's visits that you've even gone to, then you might be triggered by that, and your PTSD is going to kick in. You're going to have a massive spike in distress, and you might just leave the office, or you'll go through with the examination while you're just white knuckling it, and then you leave and you never go back to a doctor ever again. And so a trauma-informed physician would say to someone, and this is just me just making something up on the spot. I don't know exactly what the recommendations are to physicians, but I would imagine what it would entail is like you have a brand new patient and she's talking about something going on in her groin area, and you say, "Okay, so so you've given me your list of complaints. You have some pain. It sounds like in your pubis region." And there, I don't know the technical term, down there in your private parts, you have some pain. In order for me to do a proper examination to figure out what's going on so that I might figure out what treatment you need, I'm going to have to take a look at it. Now, that can be done today, or it can be done another day. It can be done by me. It can be done by someone else. And so, there's no rush. From the symptoms you're laying out, I'm not worried you're going to die today. It doesn't sound like an emergency. So, the exam could happen tomorrow if need be. But I just want to lay that out for you and ask you what you want to do. Would you like me to look at it now? Or would you like to make another appointment? Or would you like maybe another physician to look at it? I'm a man, and maybe you want a woman to look at it. It's up to you. And so you're giving the patient a very clear explanation of what is ahead and why you're suggesting that she disrobe. And you're also giving her a lot of control. You're empowering her. Because the goal is not to traumatize the patient. The goal is to meet the patient's needs, which the patient is asking for help with this pain. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be the one to do the examination. Someone else can do it. Someone else can even provide the treatment. And by giving the patient the time to think about it also gives the patient control, because if the patient is being triggered, they might not know how to make a choice right now. And so you're saying to them, you can make another appointment for that if you want tomorrow or something. That gives the patient this out. You don't want to box people in. And so the patient might be like, okay, I know I'm freaking out right now. And so yes, I want to leave the office right now and I'll rethink this whole thing. And then maybe I'll make another appointment for that. Now, there are downsides to that, right? Because what if the woman leaves and she doesn't come back and she has some kind of problem that she doesn't get treated for, and you could have assessed it and treated it right there. So there's a balance to this whole thing. Also, there's a downside to this trauma-informed care in that it requires a lot more time. You have to spend time asking those questions. You have to potentially, if she's like, oh, I'd rather have a woman look at it, then you've got to, wait around for another physician who's a woman. And, it's just a lot more time, but it's ethical practice, frankly. So that's what trauma-informed care can look like in a physician's office. And it really is quite varied. I mean, that's an obvious sort of quintessential example, but trauma can involve so many different things, right? Like, just anything that's scary, essentially. You can be traumatized by a movie. You can be traumatized by a car crash, or witnessing something happening to someone else, having just some sort of near-death experience. You can be traumatized by turbulence in an airplane. Whatever makes you terrified in the moment then can result in long-lasting residual trauma. Bad drug trips can be traumatizing. Suddenly realizing that your spouse cheated on you can be traumatizing. Your, parents dying. I know, how do I put this? I know people who have been traumatized by their parents dying, even though their parents were very, very elderly, and it was well known that the parents were going to die, that the woman, So imagine, I'm just trying to figure out how to say this without revealing who I'm talking about. So imagine that you have your mother has been in and out of the hospital for 15 years with various different ailments. And each time she goes into the hospital, you're thinking, well, this could be the end. And she's now 95 years old. And so it's just a matter of time. It's a matter of short time that your mother's going to die. And so you're prepared for it, and it's not a big shock when and if it happens. But death can still be very traumatizing to people. It's very rattling to a lot of us to just have someone snuffed out like that, especially if you have to witness certain elements of it. Like if you're there when people go into convulsions, or you're there when you are putting your pet down and the physician is injecting the substance into the veins of your loved pet. These can be traumatic events. They're not always. It just depends on the person and the way that things played out. There's certain events that are more likely to be traumatizing, like if you saw someone get shot, saw a loved one get shot right in front of you. That's much more likely to be traumatizing. But in my experience, there are just so many different things that can cause trauma and PTSD that you just can't really generalize that much. And I hate it when people try to, because anything can be scary. And people will ask me like, can you be traumatized by a movie that's really scary? And I'm like, yeah, you could be traumatized by, Ronald McDonald. You can be traumatized by an umbrella. You can be traumatized by a bumblebee. It all just depends on what produces, or what a series of events produce a sense of terror in you. That's all that's necessary. It's just the sense of terror. You can be traumatized by nothing. I mean, when I had panic attacks when I was growing up, I would have this intense panic without anything that I was afraid of. There was nothing that was actually causing the fear. And so I basically was traumatized by this sense of doom about nothing. I mean, I had this vague sense maybe I'll be dead soon or something, but it wasn't clear. So the only thing we need to have is just a sense of terror. So anyway, lots of people, domestic violence, seeing a horrible video on YouTube, for example, that can be traumatizing. So there are a lot of things, and I guess I should say it's not necessarily terror. It could be terror, like someone has you at gunpoint and you're shaking and you're like certain you're going to die. That sort of terror. But it could also be like you're watching a YouTube video and then boom, someone just dies right in front of you, or whatever sort of video. I think YouTube tries to not post stuff like that, but other websites certainly do, like I think Live Leak, is that what's called? Anyway, so there's other kinds of trauma too, where it's not necessarily where you're feeling terror. It's that images that are horrific to the soul can be traumatizing as well. Anyway, so a lot of professions are looking into trauma-informed care because so many people have been traumatized. I mean, something like statistics-wise, like the majority of people, and I might argue everyone, has some form of PTSD, either mild or severe, mild to severe. I would, or at the very least, everyone has been traumatized by something. By a certain age, if you don't have at least, 1 to 3 traumas, then, you're one of the luckiest people on the planet. So, because again, when you think about all the different things that could happen to you, that could just really be could be shocking to the system. So a lot of professions are looking at trauma-informed care, and they're thinking, okay, well, how do we do right by our patients? Not only for moral and ethical reasons, but also for management reasons. Because if you are a physician and you just go headlong into your regular treatment routine, going back to that example, say the physician just says, okay, I want you to disrobe. I'm going to step out for a second. I'm going to come back in. You step out of the room, you come back in, and the patient has not disrobed. And you're like, maybe you didn't understand me. I need you to disrobe so I can examine you. I'm going to step out of the room for a couple of minutes. I'll come back in. And then the patient, let's say the patient's like 14 years old or 15. And you're like, okay, what do I do here? Or the patient gets upset and has a breakdown of some kind, starts crying in the middle of the examination. So not only is it moral and ethical to try to have trauma-informed care, but it's also like it could really ruin your career or your day, I should say, and maybe your career if you get sued for something. But anyway, so physicians are trying to look into trauma-informed care. Teachers, foster parents, police officers, homelessness social workers, these kinds of people. So yeah. The history apparently is that trauma-informed care was originally developed to help teens and adolescent kids in inpatient, which makes a lot of sense. And then it was expanded really to all walks of life. And I would say it'd be good, I'd love it, if everyone, even your clerk at your grocery store, understood how trauma works. Because when you understand how it works, everything starts to make a lot of sense. Like when I was talking about the anger management thing, when you see someone road raging and you understand trauma, you're much more likely to accurately assess the situation and then know what to do about it. Because if someone, in the example of bumping someone in the car, why that guy was punching me is not because he was a douchebag in all likelihood, but because when I bumped his car, it freaked him out and he was terrified. He felt extreme threat in a way that he felt when he was smaller and weaker. And when you understand that, you can help the person by saying, look, I'm sorry that I bumped your car, and I'm not a threat. You don't have to get big with me right now. I'm not a threat. Everything's okay. You know, a police officer, I mean, think about how helpful it would be if all police officers understood trauma. When they roll up on someone and the person seems to be reacting quite erratically, you know, the police officer who understands trauma can be like, oh, okay, this person looks like they might be having some kind of PTSD episode, because it'll look like they're being defiant and it'll look like they're being uncooperative, because they are. But assuming that they have control over that can actually lead to things getting worse, like actually people getting shot, which I've seen videos like this where I'm like, oh, that person being arrested looks clearly like they're having a PTSD reaction. And it doesn't seem like anybody really understands that. Now, I don't know what to do about that, because it's possible that police, under a lot of circumstances, just have to proceed regardless. But I'm not saying that just because someone's being confrontational or disagreeable to a police officer that you're supposed to just let that go. But I don't know, just a little bit of knowledge about that. Okay, so Patron Karen, you're asking about tips. Well, so I have tips for parents and teachers, which are people essentially who have a lot of time with people, and spouses for that matter. I mean, I think when we talk about trauma-informed care, we're often talking about children and teenagers, but this applies to everybody. Children and teenagers are not the only people who have been traumatized. So this really applies to everybody. So tips for everyone dealing with people who are close to you are, one, be attuned, meaning you need to notice other people's emotional states and then respond in a way that is good for those people. Like naming the emotion. When you see someone that they seem distressed, you want to say something like, "It seems like you're in some distress right now. Is that right?" You want to help them understand what's happening. You can also suggest emotional regulation techniques, like, "Oh, it looks like you're really stressed out right now," and the person's like, "Yeah, I'm very stressed out right now." And you're like, "Well, when I'm stressed out, I like to relax all the muscles in my body and take a couple of deep breaths and kind of, get myself centered again." So you can suggest things. And the last thing is to model emotional regulation skills. That's really one of the best things you can do for people around you, is to show them how to deal with emotions in a real way. Especially if you're working with kids and with students, if you're a teacher, is they look up to you and they do what you do. So you can really model that for them. Now, tips for everyone who are maybe dealing with people for very short amount of time, like a physician or I guess a teacher as well, or a social worker. Here are my tips. Number one is assume everyone has been traumatized until proven otherwise. I've adopted this point of view. I assume two things about everyone until proven otherwise. They've been traumatized and they have PTSD, and they have a personality disorder. When you assume that, you proceed with caution. It means that you might spend a little bit more time with people that they don't need it, but you're definitely making sure that you're not going to step on a landmine, because with people with personality disorders and people with PTSD, you can step on landmines. So you have to just walk carefully. It's like, I guess the metaphor is like, assume every field has landmines until the minesweeper goes through there and says either there is no landmines on the field or they've identified where the landmines are. So that takes time. It takes a little bit of time to figure that out, but it's better than just walking on every field and then 1 out of every 10 fields you step on a landmine, right? Believe me, it's a bad day in your profession when you do that. So just assume that everyone has been traumatized until proven otherwise, because there's no way to tell at first. A lot of people will be like, well, she didn't seem like she had PTSD. People with PTSD don't seem like anything. There's no way you can just visually or briefly interact with someone and know that they have PTSD. There's just no way to know. Number two is pay attention to body language. When people are traumatized, they will give off a certain body language vibe, so you want to pay attention to that. Number 3 is ask for consent a lot in the beginning. Like in the example I did about the physician with the rape victim, we have, I laid out a lot of consent. Do you want me to do this? Would you like to do that? So now with some people, they might not need that. They might be like, and after a while, you kind of get the sense, or you've assessed, and they actually don't have PTSD. And so you don't have to do that as much with that person. But until you just might have to do a lot of that. Number 4 is don't assume that inaction from the person means consent. So let's say, again, getting back to our physician, let's say the physician says, so I'd like you to disrobe, and when I get back in the room, I'll perform the examination. Physician leaves, physician comes back in, the patient has disrobed, and the physician does the examination, and the physician walks away going like, okay, it was a normal interaction. Well, it's possible that the individual, the patient, was in extreme terror and PTSD triggering the entire time. And they just went along, because there's this thing that people learn to do when they're repeatedly traumatized, is to freeze. We have the fight or flight or freeze or appease. And many rape victims, particularly people who are abused growing up, they learn to freeze or appease. So just because someone is consenting or being nice doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going through something really horrible. Now, I know this really complicates things, because this means someone could say, yes, I do want this to happen, when in reality, they don't. But again, it's in the body language, and it's in the way people say things. So, for example, if you said something to this patient, you said, so I want you to disrobe, or let's say you asked a question. You say, so in order for me to figure out what's going on, I'm going to have to do a visual examination. And that means you're going to have to disrobe, and I'm going to have to, look at that. Is that okay? And let's say the patient has PTSD, and the patient says something like, sure. Okay. So the way I role played that, sure. I hope I'm revealing, or demonstrating how that, on paper is consent. But if you read the body language and the vocalization, you would say like, well, I don't know. It doesn't sound like an affirmative consent. Or the person's like, no problem. That's why I came here. Let's say they said that, you're like, I'm gonna need you to get a disrobe so I can look at it. The person's like, yep, no problem. That's why I came here. Then that indication is much more likely, meaning that the person isn't going to be triggered by, or doesn't predict they're going to be triggered by this. So you have to pay attention to that. A lot of people with PTSD, they'll just say yes with a question mark or okay, and it's not actual consent. They just believe they've been triggered, or they've been taught that they can't really assert themselves, and so you just have to be careful. Number 5 is always give people a way out. That's what I did when the role play with the physician and the patient is the physician says to her, so if you don't want to do it today, you don't have to. You could go home and make a different appointment. So you're not trapping the person. You're always giving them a way that they can get out of it. That's very easy and won't have any kind of punishments attached to it. And number 6, when people say that they're scared, you need to really pay attention to that a lot, because a lot of people with PTSD, they'll get their courage up to say something like, this kind of freaks me out. Well, if you're not aware of what that, the tip of the iceberg that's representing, then you'll just be like, oh, okay, well, it'll be fine. In fact, I had this happen to me because I had PTSD around medical procedures. For a while, whenever I went to the physician, it was my physiology would freak out. My mind was fine. I was like, I know everything's fine. Nothing bad is going to happen to me. But my body was not having it. And so I would go to some physicians and I would say, so just so that you know, I have some trauma around medical procedures. I have some reactivity to it. And I freak out, and I might panic, or I might even faint. So if something happens, I need you to listen to me when it happens. Often it was like, I would say to the physician, stop what you're doing. I need everyone to stop what they're doing, because that again gave me a sense of control and would help with my anxiety. And with some physicians, they were like, oh, okay, will do. And I could tell that they were really paying attention. Other physicians, I had this one physician say something like, oh, no, everything will be okay. You won't be afraid. Everything's fine. And I'm like, what? Like, I just told you that I know myself and I know that this procedure is going to be terrifying for me. And you just told me, no, everything's going to be fine. Well, now I'm worried even more because I can't even communicate with you effectively. So when people say, if they finally reveal that there's some fear that they have, even if you're like, like the next day they don't repeat that statement, just assume that that's still there, because that's good trauma-informed care in my opinion. Anyway, so that is my short little thing on what I would recommend people do for trauma-informed care. Let's talk about something else. All right, this next email is from an anonymous patron. They write, I always wondered why I wasn't getting better, even though I've been and seen more than one therapist since I was 10. I've been told by therapists that I wasn't doing the work. My family tells me that my therapist doesn't know what they're doing. Until my new therapist told me something recently. He told me that I wasn't getting any better because I have a high emotional influence family. A high emotional influence family. I researched it, and from my understanding, it's when a client is getting better in therapy, but they relapse back to their mental illness due to a highly critical family. I thought it would be interesting to see your take on this and the advice you can give. I thought it's important for people out there to know this, because for years, I thought it was me not doing the work, or there was something wrong with me. So I'll talk about high emotional influence families in a second, but just as a caveat getting into this, I'll say that therapy takes a long time depending on the issue at hand. I've worked with clients for over 10 years. And if you looked at any particular year, you might not see a great deal of progress. But if you look at the progress over 15 years, then you absolutely see progress. So therapy for some issues takes a long time. Now, if you're working on something like a fear of heights, then you should expect to be able to be cured of that within 5 to 10 sessions. But if you're working on something like a personality disorder or a sense of self or attachment issues, then by the nature of the neurons and the way our brain works, it takes a long time to rewire the brain in a brand new way. So that's why it takes a long time. So, and people will often say, like, it's very discouraging to hear, people will say, because I'll tell people, people will ask me like, so I've been in therapy for 6 months and I feel like I've learned some things, but I still feel like I'm falling into the same traps. I'm still in conflict with my spouse. I still lose my temper, or I still tend to isolate, or I still tend to be distorted in the way I see my spouse's behavior, and we just get caught in the same behavioral loops. And I feel like I've been in therapy for 6 months, and am I wasting my money and time? And what I'll say is, well, I'm glad you asked, because it's a rational question, and you should ask your therapist, is this worth my time and money? But the second thing I'll say is that I've never been with someone who changed that fast. It just takes too long. I wish people could change fast. I wish I could change fast. The other thing is sometimes it's not a matter of change, but just a matter of managing your issues. So sometimes the goal is unrealistic to think that your issues are just going to go away, or your quote unquote, I don't know, anonymous patron, I don't know what mental illness you're suffering from, but there are mental illnesses, so to speak, in the DSM that are just not going to go away ever. Like if you're mildly depressed or moderately depressed, the expectation that you're going to be completely not depressed is actually not reasonable. Some medications can do that for you, but for most people who suffer from depression or anxiety, it's reduced drastically through therapy and or medication, but it's never fully gone. It's just rarely fully gone. And it often comes back. And that doesn't mean that your therapy isn't working. The way to look at it, I mean, it could mean that therapy isn't working. I'm not saying your therapists are actually helping you. I can't evaluate that from this angle, but it's also possible that your symptoms are so the way to think about it is imagine if you had never been in therapy, would it be better, worse, or the same? If you're like, I'm pretty sure I'd be the same, then maybe therapy isn't working. But for a lot of people, they'll say, well, although I know I'm not better yet, I definitely know that I'd be worse off without therapy. Well, that tells you something. And I've seen this happen when, people will come to me at the age of 55 and I think, my God, if you'd only gone to a therapist when you were 30, when it was only like moderately bad, because by the time you're 55, it's really bad, because people's issues tend to get worse over time. Their isolation gets worse, their addiction gets worse, their depression gets worse, their anxiety gets worse, their agoraphobia gets worse, their personalities get worse. And so, not all the time, of course, depending on their life situation, but it often can be. And so sometimes being in therapy is just maintaining the current level of pathology and staving off it getting worse. So this is a really hard thing to evaluate. So when people are, looking at you, anonymous patron, and your therapists are saying you're not, so just reading your email, you're saying your therapists are telling you you're not doing the work. And then your family is telling you your therapist doesn't know what they're doing. Well, what that kind of indicates to me is you have a lot of people barking at you. Your family is barking at you, and your therapists are also barking at you. And when I hear that, I just have to wonder if it's some sort of projective identification that's happening, where you were barked at by your parents, and then you internalize that. So now you have this internalized dyad of, an internalized voice of someone barking at you, and then the other side of that dyad is you feeling as though you are deserving of being barked at. And so you have this dyad that's been reinforced through repetition inside your psyche, and you will try to externalize that dyad because you're trying to work it out. And so sometimes you might actually socialize through projective identification your therapist to actually bark at you in a way that your parents did. But it's not going to be in the same way, because therapists won't be seduced to bark at you in the same way, but they'll bark at you in a way that a therapist would, which some therapists will give in to these impulses to say, well, the reason why you're not getting any better is because you're not doing the work. So, obviously just on the short email, I can't tell that that's what's happening, but that would be something to think about. But anyway, so getting to your question here of a high emotional influence family, I've never heard of the term before, but I can surmise what it means. Another way of thinking about it, so, just on its face, you say high emotional influence family. Well, it kind of sounds like an abusive family, an invasive, abusive family. And that absolutely can happen. You can have abuse, if your parents are abusing. So I don't know what your issues are, and I don't know what your family situation is, but let's imagine a world in which your parents are basically emotionally abusing you, and you go to therapy every week and you're trying to get better, and then you go back into your family and they emotionally abuse you. Well, then, yeah, you're not going to get any better. That's just, especially if the problem stems from you being barked at by your family. So that's one thing. But another way to think about this is through a systemic lens, which I'm in love with as a concept. And it's our central theoretical model that we use in the couple and family therapy program at Antioch University, Seattle, which is where I've been teaching for the past 2 years. So the thing here is that the notion of systems theory is that we don't have individual minds. This is something that is quite easy to fall into, this way of thinking that I have my mind and you have your mind and they have their mind, and we're individuals, but we're not individuals, and I'll get more into that in a second. We are products of our systems. We're not just influenced by our families. We're not just influenced by society. We are a part of those family systems. We're a part of society. We're both influenced by them and we influence them back. So it's particularly our families, because they're smaller systems. So an analogy to this is that if I were to cut off my toe, would I point at my toe and say, that's me? No one would do that, right? No one would go, okay, or a fingernail or something. You would never say, that is me. You'd say, that's a part of me, right? And it's okay. What if I cut off my whole leg? Would I be like, that is me? Most people would be like, no, that's something that was attached to me before. But weren't you inside your toe in the past? Weren't you inside your leg? Wasn't your leg a definite part of you before? So none of us would look at our toe and think that that's us. In order to understand the toe, you have to understand the whole me. In order to understand my elbow, you have to understand the whole me. You have to understand my elbow and my brain and my eyes and my hair and my torso. And, you have to understand everything. In the same way, the things, we cannot be understood unless you understand the systems that we're in. You can't understand me unless you understand the family system that I'm in, or the social system that I'm in, the relationships that I'm a part of, and the society that I'm a part of. My political beliefs, for example, are highly reflective of the system in which I'm embedded. My song preferences, my food preferences, my sexuality, the meaning of my life, what I've decided to be the meaning of my life. These things did not emerge out of me alone. They emerged out of me in existence within a system. Another way to think about this is I speak English, right? Well, English didn't emerge from me. I wasn't born with English. I didn't develop the English language by myself. I developed my language clearly in response to the people around me. This is a very easy thing to understand in terms of systems theory, is that none of us believe that our language just popped out of us. You see kids slowly through trial and error and learning and interacting, they will slowly hone in on particular words and then grammar and then syntax but it's a system. It's them interacting with the people around them. And those infants have a small influence on that system as well. People can add new words, for example, or when they choose to use a particular word in a particular context at the age of 4, the rest of the family might actually start using that word. For example, my little brother, he used to carry around these satin things with him, and at some point, we started calling them his softies. Instead of like a teddy bear, he had these softies. And I wonder if my little brother actually might have even invented that word. I don't know. So that's how we are both a part of the system and we influence it. So all of us understand that language comes from that. But somehow when it comes to our mental illnesses or our belief systems, we tend to think, well, no, those are mine. I developed those myself. And I'm here to tell you, no, you did not. You're a part of it. You're definitely a part of the system. You're not a complete victim or some sort of pawn in someone else's world, but you're definitely not your own. You don't. There are other hands on the steering wheel. You definitely have a hand on the steering wheel, but there are other hands. And so that's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of Americans, because we like to think that we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we're these awesome individual heroes riding off into the sunset. I mean, the thing, just to go off that old metaphor of like the hero in American film is the cowboy riding off into the sunset by himself. And if you think about it, my God, what a lonely existence. Human beings need attachment. And that guy riding off into the sunset is going to drink himself into oblivion, or he's going to shoot up heroin, or he's going to become extremely angry and jaded and upset if he doesn't turn around and find someone to ride off into the sunset with. And those two people are probably going to drive each other crazy unless they're part of a larger societal system, a larger family system. So this idea that we can ride off into the sunset by ourselves is counter to human existence. It's counter to biology. It's counter to research, and it never works out for people. I mean, just think about like the Unabomber and this kind of thing. It's not a happy ending. So for the vast majority of people. So for example, just to put this onto earth for a second, I had a client years ago who came to me with high anxiety. So he sits down, he's like, I have a lot of anxiety. I have panic attacks sometimes. I'm worried a lot. So if I look at it through an individualistic point of view, if I'm just looking at the toe, then I would be like, okay, well, let's look at your biology. Maybe you need a medication. Let's also look at your cognitions. You know, what sort of thoughts are running through your head that might be contributing or causing the anxiety that you're experiencing. Now, these two things, biology and cognition, are important ideas. I'm not going to discount them at all. They're very helpful things to do when you're working with people with anxiety. But let's not just look at the toe. Let's look at the whole thing here. So the other thing I learned when I actually expanded out, zoomed out a little bit, and started asking him about his childhood and about his family and about his social life and the culture he's in, and I learned that he's about to go to college. He grew up in boarding schools to some extent. There was a lot of pressure on him to get good grades and to be good at sports. He was upper class, which had a certain level of pressure. But the key is that I found out that his family was loving but very distant. There are a lot of kids in the family, and he was, although he felt very loved, he felt his parents loved him, he just didn't feel like they really had a lot of time to pay attention to him. And so, as we know from the attachment deep dive, that can cause problems. Just because you didn't go, you can be attachment injured massively without ever being abused or mistreated in any obvious way. So if I went off the individualistic point of view, I would have worked with him on his cognitions, and I would have recommended that he seek out medication, anti-anxiety, benzodiazepine, this kind of thing. That wouldn't have been bad, but it would have missed what I believe to be the key cause of his anxiety, which is his attachment injuries and the general loneliness that he had in his life. And so I worked with him on educating him on how attachment can cause anxiety and it really, he really took to it. He was just like, oh my God, I really feel like that's true. And so helping the client understand himself and in terms of his own attachment, that took a while. But the second thing I did is I did family therapy, and I established the idea of attachment and the idea, I was talking to the parents and I'm like, I know you're very loving and I know you're very kind people, but I'm guessing you were raised by parents who were a little standoffish. And they're like, yeah, a little bit. And I'm like, it's a common problem in upper class families a lot of times. So I was like, okay, so we're going to have to shift this around for everybody. And I believe that your son's anxiety comes from that style of parenting. So it's going to be a little uncomfortable, but I think you'll really like this. We'll be working on how to establish secure relationships with everybody, between the parents and the marriage, between the kids and the parents. And the family loved it. They really took to it because there's nothing, there's nothing to dislike. It's like you're asking a family, would you like to be closer? And they're like, yeah. And deep down, the parents really did want to be closer to their kids, but they just had a hard time noticing that the kids needed it. And they also just didn't really know what to do. They knew how to do a number of different things in parenting very well, but it was hard for them to know how to really, really pay attention to their kids. And so it just involved a lot of contact between the parents and the kids. And it wasn't all fun and games. I mean, there were issues. There was hurt and anger that had to be worked through as well. But through that, guess what happened? No more anxiety. And I never really had to work on his cognitions through cognitive behavioral therapy, and he never needed any medication. So what a wonderful thing to see people through systemic lenses. Now, it's a pain in the ass to actually drag the parents into therapy and the siblings for that matter. It's scary. It's a hassle, but what a wonderful thing. And I don't want to treat, someone's toe. I want to treat the whole system. I want to look at the whole thing. Now, with some people, I might find that, family therapy isn't necessary, or intervening in a systemic way. I mean, the other thing is like, I wouldn't have to necessarily drag in the parents. I could have, which the parents were glad to come. I mean, they really took to it when you sell it the right way. But I could have just worked with the young man himself and worked on and coached him on how he can actually develop secure relationships with his parents outside of therapy. That I've worked. That's my primary mode, actually, with most people, is to do that. So when we look at the term high emotional influence families, we're really talking about all families. All families are high influence. So getting back to what your therapist said, anonymous patron, I'm not really sure what your therapist means when he's saying you're in a high emotional influence family, and that's why your mental illness keeps relapsing. But I'm guessing what your therapist means is that it's hard for you to develop a sense of self in their midst, and/or it's hard for you to actually move forward in your life when you're constantly being criticized by your family. And, these kinds of things, the inability to establish a sense of self, and being criticized a lot, can cause a lot of symptoms, a lot of mental illness, quote unquote, symptoms like depression, anxiety, addiction, loneliness, isolation, just general chaos, resentment, all those kinds of things. So here's the thing. A lot of therapists, a lot of people will, when they look at these kinds of scenarios and they think this is the hypothesis that they're going with, they're like, okay, you have this mental condition, and at least one of the factors is because you have this high emotional influence family. Well, it stands to reason where it's just like, we need to separate you from your family. And I'm here to tell you that almost never works, because it's impossible to separate people from their families. Now, you can eliminate contact. You can, for example, this anonymous patron, you could just stop talking to your parents, and that's a way of cutting yourself off from them. But that doesn't end the fusion with them. You're still enmeshed with them emotionally because you haven't resolved anything. So you can resolve things without talking to your parents, but what a wonderful opportunity it is for you in therapy to actually resolve things with your parents to their faces. So now that's hard work and it's scary, but it's effective. I'm here to tell you. I work with people a lot on this. A lot of the people come to me talking about things that relate to this issue in one way or another, where they have to rework their relationship with their parents, even if they're like 55 years old. So a lot of this work has to do with first knowing what you want. So with you, anonymous patron, I wonder, when your parents are criticizing you, it's like, well, what do you want to say back? Or, how do you think they're right or wrong? These kinds of questions of like, okay, what do I think? What's my evaluation of this? And then you assert it in some fair way. You don't tell them to fuck off necessarily, but you're just like, you know what? I don't appreciate when you say that to me, and I'm not going to respond to that. Or I know that what you're saying right now is not rational or fair to me, and I don't agree with what you're saying. And therapy can help you develop the notions of selfhood in you. And also I've worked with a lot of people on like, well, how do you talk to your parents in that way? Because, the first impulse that a lot of people have is like, well, I'm going to let my parents have it. And although it's fine, it's not the end of the world to do that. It's usually not the most therapeutic thing. And then once you do assert yourself, there's always a backlash within the family, because family systems operate on a homeostasis, meaning they like things to be fairly consistent, not because they're evil, but because people just don't like things. They just don't like change. No one likes change. Systems don't like change. Now, some people will be like, oh my God, I love change. And I'm like, no, you don't. You like some change. If I changed everything about your life every day, you would go crazy. If I changed where you lived, the accent, your job, your clothes, your class, your race, your sexual orientation, like it would drive you crazy, right? What you want, some people are like, well, I guess I just like changes because I feel like I'm in a rut. Okay, totally makes sense. But believe me, you like stability. Everyone wants some things to stay the same. I mean, just look at people's lives. I mean, people can change the way they dress overnight if they wanted to, and people rarely do, right? People could change the things they do after work, but they rarely do. People can change lots of different things, and people just rarely do because people like stability. Anyway, so systems like stability too. And when you start to act in a brand new way by asserting yourself and pushing back, but in a fair way, there's going to be homeostatic mechanisms that are going to kick in to push you back into the original spot. And this might be what your therapist is talking about. It's high emotional influence family. But like I said, all systems are like this. Every family system is like this. Now, some people will be like, well, you know, I don't really have a lot of contact with my family, with my parents and siblings. Well, that's a certain kind of homeostasis, right? Imagine if you were to call them every day, there would be homeostatic mechanisms to make you stop. You know, they'd be like, why are you calling so often? Or they just ignore your phone calls, or something would happen in all likelihood, because systems like to stay the same. Anyway, so that's what I'll say about that. And that brings us to the end of another chapter of me answering your emails. And I am now on I only have 13 pages left of emails. All right, well, let's, sign off for today, and tomorrow I'll read some more emails. This is fun. Cleaning out the closet. It's spring cleaning. Please take care of yourself and clean your closet because you deserve it.